Hello again. This is going to be chapter 11 of Charlotte's Web, and the chapter's called The Miracle. Now, you might remember in the last chapter we read, Charlotte had finally come up with a really good answer, a good way to help Wilbur. We weren't very clear exactly what she was thinking, but I had just read that she had taken out the middle of her web and replaced it with something. Now, you might have had a little think about what was going to go in the middle of that web. I think this chapter will reveal all. So, listen up. The next day was foggy. Everything on the farm was dripping wet, and the grass looked like magic carpet. The asparagus patch was looking like a silver forest. Now, asparagus is a tall green vegetable, grows out of the ground, little sticks about this big. So I can sort of imagine from a distance all these little sticks of asparagus on a foggy day might look a bit like a silver forest. On foggy mornings, Charlotte's Web really was a thing of beauty. This morning, each thin strand was decorated with dozens of tiny beads of water. The web glistened in the light and made a pattern of loveliness and mystery, like a delicate veil. If you're not familiar, veil, something that's worn on the head and it dangles behind. Usually women wear them when they're getting married. That's what a veil is. Even Lurvy, who wasn't particularly interested in beauty, noticed the web when he came in with the pig's breakfast. He noted how clearly it showed up. He noted how big and carefully it was made. And then he took another look, and he saw something that made him set down his pail. There, in the centre of the web, neatly woven in block letters, capital letters, was a message. It said, you see that? It said, "Some pig." That's what Charlotte was up to. Lurvy felt weak. He brushed his hand across his eyes and stared even harder at Charlotte's web. "I'm seeing things," he whispered to himself. He dropped to his knees and uttered a short prayer. Then, forgetting all about poor Wilbur's breakfast, he walked back to the house, calling Mr. Zuckerman. "I think you better come down to the pig pen," he said. "What's the trouble?" asked Mr. Zuckerman. "Anything wrong with the pig?" "No, not exactly," said Lurvy. Come and see for yourself." The two men walked silently down to Wilbur's yard. Lurvy pointed to the spider's web. "Do you see what I see?" he asked. Zuckerman stared at the writing on the web, and then he murmured to himself the words, "Some pig." Then he looked at Lurvy. Then they both began to tremble. Charlotte, sleepy after her night's exertions, smiled as she watched them. Wilbur came and stood directly underneath the web. "Some pig," murmured Lurvy in a low voice. "Some pig," whispered Mr. Zuckerman. They stared and stared for a long time at Wilbur, and then they stared at Charlotte. "You don't suppose that spider—" began Mr. Zuckerman, but then he shook his head and he never finished the sentence. Instead, he walked solemnly back to the house. Solemnly, you understand that word? Means, it means feeling solemn, which is quiet and serious. He spoke to his wife. "Edith," he said, "something has happened," and he spoke in a weak voice. He went into the living room and sat down, and Mrs. Zuckerman joined him. "I've got something to tell you, Edith," he said. "You better come sit down." Mrs. Zuckerman sank into a chair, looking pale and frightened. "Edith," he said, and he tried to keep his voice steady. "Edith, I think you had best be told that we have a very unusual pig." Now, a look of complete bewilderment, like puzzlement, a look of complete bewilderment came over Mrs. Zuckerman's face. "Homer Zuckerman, what on earth are you talking about?" she said. "This is a very serious thing, Edith," said Mr. Zuckerman. "Our pig is completely out of the ordinary." "What's unusual about the pig?" asked Mrs. Zuckerman, who was now beginning to recover from her scare. Well, I don't really know yet," said Mr. Zuckerman, "but we have received a sign, Edith, a mysterious sign. A miracle has appeared on the farm. There is a large spider's web in the corner of the barn cellar. It's right over the pig pen, and when Lurvy went to feed the pig this morning, he noticed the web, because it was foggy, and you know how a spider's web looks very distinct in the fog. And right sprang in the middle of the web, there were the words, 'Some pig.' The words, they were woven right into the web. They were actually part of the web, Edith. I know because I have just been down there and seen it. It says 'Some pig' just as clear as day. There can be no mistake about it. A miracle has happened and a sign has occurred here on earth, right in our farm. We have no ordinary pig." "Well," said Mrs. Zuckerman, "it seems to me you're a little off. It seems to me we have no ordinary spider." "Oh no," said Zuckerman, "it's the pig that is unusual. It says so right there in the middle of the web." "That may be so," said Mrs. Zuckerman. "Just the same, I intend to go and have a look at that spider." "It's just a common grey spider," said Mr. Zuckerman. They got up, and together they walked down to Wilbur's yard. "You see, Edith, it's just a common grey spider." Now Wilbur was very pleased to receive so much attention. Lurvy was still standing there, and Mr. and Mrs. Zuckerman too, all three, and they stood for over an hour reading the words on the web over and over and watching Wilbur. Charlotte was delighted with the way her trick was working. She sat without moving a muscle, and she listened to the conversation of the people around her. When a small fly blundered into the web, just beyond the word pig, Charlotte dropped quickly down, rolled the fly up and carried it out of the way. After a while the fog lifted, the web dried off and the words didn't show up so plainly. The Zuckermans and Lurvy walked back to the house, but just before they left the pig pen, Mr. Zuckerman took one last look at Wilbur. "You know," he said in an important voice, "I've thought all along that pig of ours was an extra good one. He's a solid pig. That pig is as solid as they come. You notice how solid he is around the shoulders, Lurvy?" Sure I do," replied Lurvy. "I've always noticed that pig. He's quite a pig." He's long and smooth," said Zuckerman. "That's right," agreed Lurvy. "He's as smooth as they come. He's some pig." Now ask yourselves, is that what Lurvy and Zuckerman really thought of Wilbur when Wilbur first came to the farm? Think back to the very beginning of the story and how Wilbur came to be in the first place. When Mr. Zuckerman got back to the house, he took off his work clothes and he put on his best suit. Then he got into his car and drove to the minister's house. You know what a minister is? We perhaps might call a minister a vicar or a priest. He stayed for a whole hour, explaining to the minister that a miracle had just happened on his farm. "Now so far," said Zuckerman, "only 4 people on earth know about this miracle. Myself, my wife Edith, my hired man Lurvy, and now you." "Well, don't tell anybody else yet," said the minister. "We don't know what it means yet, but perhaps if I give thought to it, I can explain it in my sermon next Sunday." If you're not familiar with that word sermon, that's a talk that a vicar or priest gives during a Sunday service at church. There can be no doubt, the priest continued, there can be no doubt that you have a most unusual pig. I intend to speak about it in my sermon and point out the fact that this community has been visited with a wondrous animal. By the way, does the pig have a name? Why, yes, said Mr. Zuckerman. My little niece calls him Wilbur. She's rather a queer child, rather full of many notions. She's raised the pig on a bottle, and I bought him from her when he was a month old. He shook hands with the minister and left. Now, secrets are hard to keep. Long before Sunday came, the news spread all over the county. Everybody knew that a sign had appeared in a spider's web on Zuckerman's place. Everybody knew that the Zuckermans had a wondrous pig. People came from miles around to look at Wilbur and read the words on the web. In fact, we have an illustration here that shows you those people coming to take a look. The Zuckermans' driveway became full of cars and trucks from morning till night. There were Fords and Chevys and Buick Roadmasters and GMC pickups and Plymouths, Studebakers and Packards. These are all American cars from the era when this story was written. DeSotos with gyromatic transmissions and Oldsmobiles with rocket engines, Jeep station wagons and Pontiacs. The news of this wondrous pig spread clear up the hills, and farmers came rattling down in buggies and buckboards to stand hour after hour at Wilbur's pen, admiring the miraculous animal. All had said they had never seen such a pig before in their lives. When Fern told her mother that Avery had tried to hit the Zuckerman's spider with a stick, Mrs. Arable was so shocked that she sent Avery to bed without any supper as a punishment. In the days that followed, Mr. Zuckerman was so busy entertaining visitors, he neglected his farm work. He wore his good clothes all the time now, got right into them when he got up in the morning. Mrs. Zuckerman started preparing special meals for Wilbur. Lurvy had a shave and a haircut, and his principal farm duty was to feed the pig while people looked on. Mr. Zuckerman ordered Lurvy to increase Wilbur's feedings from 3 meals a day to 4 meals a day. The Zuckermans were so busy with their visitors, they forgot about other things on the farm. The blackberries got ripe, and Mrs. Zuckerman never put up any blackberry jam. The corn needed hoeing, but Lurvy never found time to hoe the corn. On Sunday, the church was full. The minister explained this miracle. He said that the words on the spider's web proved that human beings must always be on the watch for the comings of wonders. All in all, the Zuckerman's pig pen became the centre of attention. Fern was happy, for she felt sure that Charlotte's trick was working and that Wilbur's life would be saved. But she found the barn was not nearly so pleasant. Too many people. She liked it better when she could be alone with all her friends, the animals. And that explains the miracle of Charlotte's Web and her writing. But I'm wondering where this story could go now. We're not even halfway through, maybe exactly halfway through it. What on earth is going to pan out next? Chapter 12 is called A Meeting. Why don't you think about who that meeting might be between and what it is they're going to talk about? Chapter 12 in the next video. Until then, bye for now.